A story of silence, blood, and the mark that was never a curse. She had not spoken a single word in 4 years. Not from injury. Not from fear. Not from the broken spirit that the Dust Hollow Pack had decided was the explanation, and had stopped questioning because the explanation was convenient. They mocked her for it constantly. They asked her questions at pack assembly and watched her not answer and made it a game, the kind of game that people play when they have decided someone has no way to respond. The beta's son would lean across the communal table and say, "Why won't you speak, Sable? Is it because you have nothing to say? Is it because the words are too heavy for an Omega to carry? Is it because you know that when you open your mouth we will all find out that there is even less inside than we already think?" She would look at him. She would look at him with those charcoal dark eyes that had a quality people described differently depending on how they felt about her. The pack wolves who dismissed her said they were empty. The pack wolves who were more honest with themselves, but still kept their distance, said they were the most unsettling eyes they had ever looked into, the eyes of someone who was reading a book in a language the reader did not know you spoke. She never looked away. She had been choosing silence since she was 19 years old, the night she understood what the mark on her back meant and what would happen to her if the pack ever connected the mark to what it was capable of. The mark. 7 interlocking circles, the diameter of a spread hand, positioned at the center of her upper back between the shoulder blades. She had been born with it. Her mother had covered it from the day she was born and had told no one, and had died when Sable was 8, still carrying the secret. Sable had found the meaning herself at 19 in a restricted section of the pack library that she had accessed after 3 years of quiet, systematic preparation. The oldest wolf texts called the mark the Sealbreaker's brand. It appeared once in a bloodline and then disappeared for generations before appearing again. The wolf who carried it could not speak in human form without the mark activating. And when the mark activated, what came out of the carrier's voice was not words. It was a command that the wolf hierarchy at every level below the carrier was physically incapable of refusing. Every wolf who heard it would do what the voice said. Without exception. Without the ability to choose otherwise. She had not spoken a word in 4 years because the last time she had spoken, before she understood what she was, she had told the Dust Hollow Alpha to stop. Just that one word. Stop. He had been mid-sentence in a formal address to the assembled pack. He stopped. Every wolf in the assembly stopped. The silence lasted for 11 seconds before she understood what had happened and felt the cold certainty of what her life was going to have to be from that moment forward. She had never spoken again.
Still nothing to say,
For years later, the Alpha King's representative arrived at the Dust Hollow Pack with a formal inquiry about a bloodline anomaly in their regional records, and the world Sable had been surviving in very quietly was about to discover that silence had been the longest and most patient form of preparation it had ever misread as weakness. Subscribe, comment, like, and share. Hit subscribe and share this with everyone who loves a wolf heroine whose power they have never seen before. Like the video. Chapter 1. The Wolf Who Chose Quiet. The Dust Hollow Pack occupied the southern lowlands of the Ashvale Territory Range, a stretch of forested valley and river country that was neither the most strategically valuable land in the region nor the least, which was itself a kind of safety. Packs that occupied strategically valuable territory attracted the ambitions of larger packs. Packs that occupied strategically unimportant territory attracted contempt. The Dust Hollow Pack had maintained its position in the specific middle of those two pressures for 3 generations under the Marin bloodline, and the current alpha, Gareth Marin, had spent his 17 years of leadership continuing that tradition with the same workman-like competence his predecessors had applied. Sable Voss had been a member of the Dust Hollow Pack for 23 years, which was the entirety of her life, and she had been classified as Omega from her first assessment at 12 years old. She did not dispute the classification. She had spent 11 years, from the age of 12 to the age of 23, making the classification into something that functioned as precisely as possible for her specific purposes. Not as armor exactly. As architecture. The Omega classification determined how the pack saw her, how they filed her, how they thought about her capabilities and her purpose and her potential for causing problems. An Omega who did not speak was, in the Das Hollow Pack's operational understanding of things, an Omega who could be assigned work and dismissed from consideration, and generally not thought about with any great depth. That was exactly what she needed. She kept the pack house kitchen and the eastern perimeter wards and the healing herb stores. She carried messages that the pack needed carried. She performed the dozen maintenance tasks that kept a community of 190 wolves functional and that nobody who had options wanted to do. She did all of it with the efficient invisibility of someone who had decided that the least observed version of herself was the safest version, and had spent 11 years making that decision so complete that it was no longer a decision, but simply the texture of how she existed. The mockery was part of the architecture. She had thought about this carefully when she was 19 and still processing the full implications of what she was. She had reached the conclusion that attempting to prevent the mockery would require spending social capital she did not have and drawing attention she could not afford. The mockery was information the pack filed in the column next to Omega and silent and unremarkable. Every time Destan, the beta's son, leaned across the table and asked why she would not speak, he was confirming his own assessment of her in a way that made him less likely to look more carefully. She let him. She let all of them. She was good at letting things happen to her exterior self that had nothing to do with what was happening inside. The morning the Alpha King's representative arrived was a morning like most mornings in the Das Hollow Packhouse, which meant that Sable was in the kitchen at the hour before dawn preparing the morning meal rotation, and that the activity around her was the activity of a pack moving through its established rhythms. She heard the representatives arrive not through the kitchen window but through the specific change in the packhouse's atmospheric quality that she had developed the ability to read across 11 years of paying very close attention to things that other people registered as background. The quality changed because whoever had come through the main gate was someone the packhouse wolves were reorganizing around without quite knowing why. She continued preparing the morning meal. She continued preparing it when Gareth Marin's head beta came to the kitchen door and said the Alpha wanted all pack members in the main hall in 20 minutes for a formal announcement. She brought the morning meal to the serving table and then went to the main hall with everyone else. The Alpha King's representative was a wolf named Corvus, which she recognized as a name associated with the King's intelligence service. He was in his late 40s, silver-haired and lean, with the specific professional neutrality of someone who had been delivering significant information to packs for long enough that the information no longer reorganized his expression regardless of its content. He stood at the front of the hall beside Gareth Marin and he said, in the formal language of Interpack Royal Inquiry, that the Alpha King's Intelligence Division had identified a bloodline anomaly in the Das Hollow Pack's historical registry. He said the anomaly related to a specific genetic marker that appeared in the records of a wolf born in the pack 23 years ago. He said the Alpha King's inquiry was formal and required the cooperation of the pack and the individual concerned. He said the individual concerned was registered as Sable Voss. The hall went quiet. Not the quiet of shock exactly. The quiet of a community that has just learned that the person it has collectively decided to notice least has been noticed by someone significantly above their own level of authority. Gareth Marin looked across the hall at Sable with the expression of a man who has just discovered that something he filed under unremarkable was actually filed in the wrong category. She looked back at him with those dark charcoal eyes. She did not change her expression. She had known this was coming for 4 years. Not the specific mechanism, not the specific representative or the specific format. But she had known with the certainty of someone who had read enough of the old bloodline texts to understand that the Sealbreaker's brand was documented there, and that the Alpha King's intelligence apparatus was thorough enough to eventually cross-reference a living bloodline anomaly with its historical documentation. She had prepared for it. Her preparation had taken 4 years and had involved a very specific kind of work, the kind of work that silent people can do inside communities that have stopped watching them because they decided there was nothing to see. She had been reading everything the pack library had that was relevant. Everything she could access through the regional archive request system that the pack used for administrative purposes, which had a research function that she had used with sufficient spacing and sufficient cover material that her specific requests had not registered as a pattern to anyone monitoring the system. She knew more about the Sealbreaker's brand than anyone alive. She knew what it could do at full expression and what it required and what its limitations were and what the old text said had happened the last time it had appeared in an active bloodline. She knew what was about to happen. She walked to the front of the hall. Not because she was afraid. Because the moment Corvus had said her name, the architecture of her chosen invisibility had become irrelevant, and she was not going to perform invisibility when it served no further purpose. Corvus watched her come. He said, "Sable Voss." She nodded. He said, "The Alpha King has requested your presence at the Ashbale capital for a formal assessment. This is a royal request and cooperation is required under the Interpact Treaty framework." She nodded again. He said, "The formal assessment will include a bloodline verification and a capability evaluation. Do you have any questions about the process?" She held out her hand. He looked at the hand for a moment. Then he reached into the formal document case he was carrying and he found a piece of paper and a writing instrument and he gave them to her. She wrote, "When do we leave?" He read it. He said, "Tomorrow morning at dawn." She wrote, "I will be ready." She turned and walked back through the hall. The Dus Hollow Pack watched her go with the specific quality of people who are revising a long-held understanding of something and finding the revision uncomfortable. Destan, at the back of the hall, said nothing. For the first time in 4 years, he said nothing. She noticed that. She filed it under. "The architecture was more effective than I knew." She went back to the kitchen and she finished the morning meal preparation because it still needed doing and because she had always completed what she started. Then she went to her room and she packed. It did not take long. She traveled light by both necessity and practice. But she packed one thing that she had been preparing for 4 years. The document. 23 pages of close handwriting that constituted the most comprehensive private record of the Sealbreaker's brand ever assembled by a living wolf. The history. The documented uses in the texts. The theoretical framework for the capabilities scope. The analysis of every reference she had found to the previous carrier, 3 generations back. And her own assessment, built from 4 years of careful self-observation while maintaining complete silence, of what she believed she was capable of and what she had never tested. She put it in the inner pocket of her traveling coat. She went to sleep. She slept well. She had been sleeping well for 4 years, which people would have found surprising if they had known about the weight she was carrying. She slept well because she had made a decision at 19 and had spent 4 years executing it with complete consistency, and there was a specific quality of rest available to people who had made a complete decision and were not second-guessing it. Tomorrow, the capital. Tomorrow, finally, the conversation she had been preparing for. Chapter 2. The King Who Read the Old Texts. Alpha King Dorian Ashur had 2 qualities that his court found occasionally inconvenient and that had collectively produced a kingdom significantly better organized and significantly more just than the one he had inherited. The first quality was that he read everything. Not summaries. Not briefings. The actual texts, primary sources, the original documents with their marginal notations and their inconsistencies, and the specific quality of information that exists in the gap between what a document says and how it says it. He had been reading this way since he was 15, and it had given him, at 33, an understanding of his kingdom's institutional history that none of his advisors could fully match, and that occasionally produced conclusions they had not anticipated and could not argue with, because he had gotten there through the texts and they had gotten there through the summaries of the texts. The second quality was that he did not decide things were impossible until he had verified the impossibility himself. These 2 qualities had combined to produce the specific situation of the Alpha King sitting in his private study at the Ashbale capital on the evening Corvus's inquiry report came in. Reading the bloodline documentation his intelligence division had cross-referenced against the historical archive, and arriving at a conclusion that the bloodline division had flagged as requiring immediate attention, and that Dorian had confirmed required it for reasons the bloodline division had not fully understood. The Sealbreaker's brand. He had read about it in the restricted archive 3 years ago, in the context of a broader study of the old bloodline texts that had been part of his self-directed education in the kingdom's pre-governance history. The brand was documented in 2 separate primary texts and referenced obliquely in 4 others. The documentation was incomplete because the last carrier, 3 generations back, had lived in an era when the institutional response to rare bloodline capabilities was suppression rather than study. The last carrier had not been suppressed. The last carrier had walked into the regional council chamber when she was 26 years old and had said something that the historical record described only as a declaration, and every wolf in the chamber had agreed to it without a single dissenting voice. And the regional governance structure had been reorganized around that declaration for the next 40 years. The texts did not record what she had said. They recorded what happened after. Dorian had read those records and had filed the Sealbreaker's brand in the category of things that required attention if a living carrier was ever identified, and had left standing instructions with his intelligence division to flag any bloodline anomaly that matched the marker profile. Corvus had flagged it 3 days ago. The carrier was 23 years old, classified as Omega in the Dust Hollow Pack registry, and had not spoken a word in 4 years. He read that last detail and sat with it. A wolf who understood what the Sealbreaker's brand was and what it did when activated would choose silence. Not as a symptom of damage or distress. As a deliberate management of a capability that could not be safely used in an uncontrolled environment. The fact that she had chosen silence suggested she knew what she was. The fact that she had maintained it for 4 years suggested she had known for at least that long. The fact that the pack she lived in had been using her silence as material for mockery rather than recognizing it as a form of discipline that most wolves could not have maintained for 4 hours, let alone 4 years, said something specific about the Dust Hollow Pack's collective intelligence that he was going to address separately. He met Corvus's company at the Capitol Gate when they arrived on the second morning. He had not announced that he would be there. Corvus, riding at the front of the company, registered the king's presence at the gate with the specific quality of someone who had worked for Dorian long enough to recognize when his king was doing something that fell outside standard protocol, and had stopped questioning the specific reasons because the reasons were always good ones. He said, "She is in the 3rd position behind me." Dorian looked past him. She was in dark traveling clothing, a long dark coat over fitted dark riding clothes and high boots, all of it quality material that was completely without ornamentation. Her hair was dark and worn in a practical knot at the back of her head. Her face was turned slightly away from the gate, looking at the Capitol walls in the specific manner of someone who is cataloging information about an environment while appearing simply to be looking at it. When the company rode through the gate, she was 6 feet from him. She looked at him. He looked at her. Her eyes were charcoal dark with a quality he had read about in the texts and had categorized as probably documented imprecisely until this moment. The text described the Sealbreaker's carrier as having eyes that communicated a depth of internal processing that was distinguishable from standard wolf intelligence in the same way that deep water was distinguishable from shallow water even when both surfaces looked calm. The text had not been imprecise. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was appropriate and then looked forward and rode through the gate. He turned and followed. The formal assessment was scheduled for the following morning. He had the evening. He went to his study. He wrote a note. The note said, "I have read the primary texts on the Sealbreaker's brand. I believe you have also read them. I would like to speak with you informally before the formal assessment tomorrow. If you are willing, come to the North Study at the evening bell. If you are not willing, I will understand and we will proceed directly to the formal assessment in the morning." He signed it with his name, not his title. He sent it with the wolf assigned to her guest quarters. She arrived at the North Study 11 minutes after the evening bell. She was carrying a document. She sat across the reading table from him and put the document on the table between them. He looked at it. He said, "May I?" She pushed it toward him. He read it. He read all 23 pages of it without stopping. It took 40 minutes. She sat across the table from him for those 40 minutes with the specific quality of someone who is entirely comfortable with the silence they have chosen, which was different from someone who was uncomfortable and hiding it, and different again from someone who had nothing going on internally. She was thinking. He could tell she was thinking from the way her expression moved in small variations that were not quite visible unless you were looking for them. He finished. He put the document down. He said, "This is the most comprehensive private analysis of the Sealbreaker's brand I have ever seen, and I have read everything in the Royal Restricted Archive." She produced a small notebook from inside her coat and wrote in it and turned it to face him. It said, "The Royal Restricted Archive is missing 3 primary sources. I can tell you where to find them." He looked at what she had written. He said, "Where?" She wrote, "The Harrowmere Regional Library. The access system indexes them under herbal lore because whoever cataloged the collection in the 4th generation did not recognize what they were. I accessed them through the Dust Hollow Pack's regional research request system over 14 months. He said, "The Dust Hollow Pack uses a shared regional system." She wrote, "I spaced the requests across 14 months and used cover material from the herbal classification to contextualize each request. No one flagged it." He said, "You have been doing this for how long?" She wrote, "I understood what I was at 19. I have been building the documentary record for 4 years." He said, "And choosing silence for the same period." She wrote, "The silence was necessary while I was in an environment where I could not control who heard me." He said, "And now?" She looked at him. She wrote, "Now I am in the presence of the only wolf whose authority in the hierarchy is above the range at which the brand activates automatically. The old texts are not explicit about this, but the implication is clear from the documented instances. The Sealbreaker's brand activates involuntary compliance in every wolf below a specific authority threshold. You are above that threshold." She wrote, "Which means I can speak to you without the activation occurring." He said, "You have not spoken in 4 years." She wrote, "I am aware." He said, "I am not going to ask you to do it now simply because I have just explained to you that it is technically possible." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote, "I appreciate that." He said, "What do you want from the formal assessment tomorrow?" She wrote, "I want the capability formally documented and formally classified in a framework that does not require me to continue hiding it. I want the Sealbreaker's brand registered in the Royal Bloodline record with accurate documentation of its scope and limitations. I want the institutional status that makes the capability governable rather than dangerous." She wrote, "And I want it governed by me, not managed by the Crown, not deployed as a royal asset. Governed by me on terms I determine, with formal documentation of those terms in the treaty record." He said, "You have thought about this carefully." She wrote, "I have had 4 years and very few conversational distractions." The corner of his mouth moved. He said, "The formal assessment tomorrow is going to require me to verify the capability." She wrote, "I know. I have been thinking about how to do that safely. The activation is voice-triggered. Any wolf present during the verification who is below the authority threshold will be affected. The only safe verification is one where the only wolf present is you." He said, "A private verification." She wrote, "Yes. I understand that this is procedurally irregular. I am also the first documented living carrier in 3 generations, and irregular procedures are proportionate to the situation." He said, "I agree." He said, "Tomorrow morning. Private verification in the North Courtyard where the acoustics are contained and the space is controlled." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "I want to ask you something that is not part of the formal process." She waited. He said, "The mockery. For years of it. Did you consider ending it?" She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing their words with particular care, which was interesting given that she was choosing them in writing. She wrote, "Ending it would have meant speaking. Speaking would have meant the activation. The activation in a pack house full of ordinary pack wolves would have been catastrophic in ways I cannot fully predict because I have never tested the full scope. I considered the cost of the mockery against the cost of the catastrophe, and the calculation was not difficult." She wrote, "The mockery was survivable. I survived it. He said, yes, you did. He said it with a quality in his voice that was not pity and was not the performed sympathy of a formal acknowledgement. It was the specific recognition of someone who understood the size of what she had just described and was registering it accurately. She looked at him. She wrote, "You are easier to talk to than I expected a king to be." He said, "I am told that regularly. I have not decided if it is a compliment." She wrote, "It is." She put the notebook back in her coat. She stood. She held out her hand. He stood and took it. It was a formal gesture, and it was also not only a formal gesture, because the handshake between them lasted a half-second longer than formal protocol required, and both of them registered that half-second without performing anything about it. She left. He sat back down at the reading table and looked at the 23 pages of her document for a long time. Then he went to the Royal Restricted Archive and found the catalog for the Harrowmere Regional Library and found the 3 sources she had described, misfiled under herbal lore exactly as she had said. He read them. She had been right about everything they contained. Chapter 3. The Word That Shook the North. The north courtyard of the Ashvale capital was a small walled space that had been used for private council meetings and sensitive diplomatic exchanges for 2 generations. Its walls were thick pale stone and its floor was swept clean before dawn every morning, and it had the specific acoustic quality of enclosed spaces with hard surfaces that carried sound with unusual clarity within its boundaries and absorbed it at the walls. Dorian had chosen it for those acoustic properties. He stood at the center of it on the morning of the private verification alone. He had sent his personal guard to the outer perimeter. He had done this without explaining the reason, and his guard had accepted it with the professionalism of wolves who understood that the king sometimes required spaces that were genuinely private and who had worked out their own methods for maintaining security perimeter without breaching it. Sable came through the courtyard door at the exact time they had agreed. She was wearing the same dark traveling coat, which he was now reading as a deliberate choice rather than the default clothing of someone who had not been given other options. The coat had deep interior pockets. It was built for function. It was the clothing of someone who had decided that what they were going to need in any given situation was to be able to move and to have their materials at hand, and had dressed accordingly for the last several years. She stopped in the center of the courtyard. He was 10 feet from her. She produced the notebook. She wrote, "Before we proceed, I want to confirm the authority threshold question." The text described the threshold in terms of the old hierarchy rather than the current pack classification system. "I believe you are above the threshold. I am not certain. If I am wrong, the activation will occur regardless of your classification, and I need you to understand that before we continue." He said, "If the activation occurs and you are wrong about the threshold." She wrote, "You will hear a command and you will be unable to refuse it. I will not issue a command intentionally. The activation is triggered by any vocalization, not by specific intent. The first thing I say will activate it regardless of what I say." He said, "Understood." She wrote, "I am going to say one word. I am going to choose it carefully. If you are above the threshold, nothing will happen except that you will hear a word. If you are below the threshold, the word will function as a command and you will act on it regardless of your will." He said, "What word?" She wrote, "Stay." He looked at the word on the paper. He said, "That is the word you are choosing." She wrote, "It is the word I said 4 years ago that showed me what I was. It is a word whose effect I can assess from the outside by observing whether you remain where you are or whether you feel compelled to do something other than that. And it is a word whose command effect, if the threshold is wrong and the activation occurs, will not harm you." He said, "It is also the word that started this." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "I am ready." She looked at him. She breathed. She opened her mouth. And for the first time in 4 years, Sable Voss spoke. She said, "Stay." The word came out of her with a quality that the court and kingdom would spend years trying to describe adequately, and that was captured most closely in the account of the only witness present, which was Dorian himself, who described it afterward as the sound a word makes when it has been held inside for 4 years and released with the complete precision of someone who had been learning its weight the entire time it was being held. He felt it. He felt it pass through him the way a very deep sound passes through a body before it registers as sound, a vibration in the bones first and then the hearing. And in his chest his wolf registered the frequency, and he felt the activation signal of the Sealbreaker's brand make contact with every tier of the hierarchy that lived in him. He did not feel compelled to stay. He felt the activation make contact and slide past him the way water slides past stone, recognizing an obstacle and moving around it rather than through it. The threshold had held. He was above it. He said, "I felt it. You are correct about the threshold." She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for 4 years and has just had it confirmed that the calculation they made about the weight was accurate. She was also crying. Not dramatically. The specific quiet way that people cry when the release is significant, but the person releasing it has a great deal of practice at not performing what they are feeling. 2 lines of tears, present and acknowledged and not hidden, but also not amplified into anything beyond what they were. He did not comment on them. He said, "The verification is confirmed. The Sealbreaker's brand is active. Your assessment of the threshold is accurate." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "Would you like to stop here or continue?" She wrote, "I would like to continue. I have 23 years of silence to make up for, and I would like to keep talking if that is permissible." He said, "It is permissible." She took a breath. She said, in the voice that was going to become one of the most significant voices in the kingdom's political history over the next several years, "Then we should discuss the formal classification. I have thoughts about the framework." Her voice was low and even and precise, not theatrical. The voice of someone who chose words because of what they meant and not for any other reason, who had spent 4 years in silence developing an understanding of the value of a word that most wolves never developed. He said, "I have read your document. I agree with most of your framework and have questions about 2 sections." She said, "Which sections?" He said, "The limitation analysis in the 3rd section. You described the activation range as extending to all wolves below the authority threshold within voice range. I believe the old text suggests the range may be broader than standard voice range under certain conditions." She said, "You read the Harrowmere sources." He said, "Last night. The 4th source is particularly interesting on the resonance question." She said, "I agree. The resonance data is incomplete. I have a theory about the mechanism, but I have not been able to test it without risking uncontrolled activation." He said, "We can test it here. Safely." She looked at him. She said, "You are taking this remarkably in stride." He said, "I read the texts. I had 3 years to think about how I would handle this situation before you arrived. I am not without preparation." She said, "That is the most reassuring thing you could have said to me." He said, "Good." They spent 3 more hours in the North Courtyard. They tested the resonance theory, carefully and with the specific methodical precision of 2 people who had both read the same texts and were now working from the same analytical framework, but with different experiential knowledge. Hers of the capability from the inside and his of the governance implications from the outside. The resonance theory was partially correct and partially wrong in ways that were themselves informative. She documented everything in the notebook in real time. He observed and asked questions. At the end of 3 hours she said, "I need to stop. For years of silence and 3 hours of talking is sufficient for one morning." He said, "Of course." He said, "The formal classification session is this afternoon. I am going to propose a framework that is based on your document with the modifications we discussed this morning. I want you present, and I want you to correct me if I get anything wrong." She said, "You will not get anything wrong." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you read the primary sources before the summary and because you asked the right questions in the courtyard. You get things wrong in different ways." He said, "What ways?" She said, "You will get things wrong about the personal experience of having the capability. The text can describe it, but they cannot convey it from the inside. That is where I will need to correct you." He said, "Fair." She said, "Dorian." He looked at her. She said, "Thank you for the note last night." For reading the document before meeting me. For the private verification instead of the formal one. She said, "It mattered." He said, "I know." He said it with the same quality of voice he had used the night before when he said she had survived it. The specific recognition that was neither pity nor performance, and that she had not encountered often enough in her 23 years to have become comfortable receiving it. She walked back to the guest quarters. The courtyard was very quiet after she left. He stood in it for a few minutes. He was thinking about a number of things, the formal classification framework and the governance implications, and the 3 sections of the document he wanted to discuss further. He was also thinking about the specific way her voice sounded after 4 years of silence, which was not something he had anticipated thinking about and which he was going to need to file in an appropriate category before the formal session this afternoon. He had not yet determined what the appropriate category was. This story is not finished with you yet. Stay, subscribe, and leave a comment and tell us what you think of Sable. Has silence ever been used as a weapon like this before in a story you have watched? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a wolf heroine who does not explain herself to people who are not ready to understand her. Like the video. Comment. Share it everywhere. Do all 4 right now and then keep watching. Subscribe. Like. Comment and share. Chapter 4. The fight they brought to the capital. The Greyvale Syndicate's move came on the 9th day of Sable's presence at the Ashvale capital. She had known it was coming. Not from the ground frequency or the old bloodline capabilities. From 4 years of reading everything she could access about the political landscape of the Northern Territories and the specific interests that the Sealbreaker's brand documentation would threaten once it became known that a living carrier existed and was formally classified. The Greyvale Syndicate was not a pack in the standard sense. It was a network of 4 packs that had been operating under a shared governance agreement for 20 years and that had built its collective power on the specific ability to compel participation in that agreement through mechanisms that were technically within the bounds of the treaty framework, but that operated close enough to the edge of those bounds that anyone paying attention could see what the mechanisms actually were. A living carrier of the Sealbreaker's brand, formally classified and formally protected, was a direct threat to the compulsion mechanisms that the Syndicate's agreement depended on. Because the brand's activation did not discriminate between pack wolves and Syndicate council members. Because if a carrier could be compelled to speak in a Syndicate governance session, the compulsion mechanisms the Syndicate used would be overridden by something older and more absolute. The Syndicate had 2 possible responses to a formally classified living carrier. The first was to work within the treaty framework and negotiate the governance implications. The second was to eliminate the carrier before the formal classification was complete. She had calculated the probability of the second response at above 60%. She had told Dorian on day 3. He had already been running the same calculation. The capital's defensive posture had been quietly adjusted on day 4 without public announcement. The adjustment was quiet enough that the Syndicate's intelligence network, which was good but not comprehensive, had not registered it as significant. On the 9th day, the Syndicate's action unit, 16 wolves in the unmarked dark clothing of operational fieldwork, entered the Ashvale capital through the Eastern Tradesman's Gate during the high-traffic morning window when the gate volume made individual observation difficult. Sable felt them. Not through a bloodline capability. Through 11 years of being the most observant wolf in any room she occupied while appearing to be the least significant one. She was in the capital's eastern market when they came through the gate, and she felt the quality of the market change in the way that she could feel it change because she had been reading environmental quality changes for 4 years in the Dust Hollow packhouse and had developed a precision in that reading that was its own kind of capability. 16 wolves moving with the suppressed intentionality of operational fieldwork. She was at the market on her own, which was itself information the Syndicate had apparently been provided. Someone in the capital's administrative structure had known she would be at the Eastern Market on the 9th morning and had passed that information to the Syndicate. Another source to identify. She filed it and moved. Not toward the palace. Toward the secondary intelligence post that Dorian had shown her on day 4 when he briefed her on the defensive adjustment, a small building 2 streets from the Eastern Market that maintained a direct signal line to the palace command structure. She reached it before the action unit had covered a third of the market distance. She wrote the signal on the post's contact surface: 16 operatives, Eastern Market, heading palace. Intelligence breach. Source and administrative structure. The response came in 4 minutes. It said, confirmed. Response deploying. You are requested to shelter in place. She thought about that for approximately 3 seconds. She went back out. The intelligence post was inside the activation range of the Sealbreaker's brand if she spoke at full projection, which she had tested in the North Courtyard on day 4 and confirmed could reach 3 times the range of standard speaking volume under the specific resonance conditions she had identified. The Eastern Market had those resonance conditions. She walked back to the Eastern Market with the specific quality of someone who knows exactly what they are going to do and has accounted for the cost of doing it. She stepped into the center of the market. The 16 syndicate operatives were 20 meters from her when she stepped into the center. They saw her. They registered that she had seen them. The formation leader made the signal to close on the target. Sable shifted. She shifted because the activation range was not limited by wolf form or human form. The old texts were clear on this point, and the wolf form gave her options she did not have in human form when what came after the activation had to be managed physically. The wolf she became was the color of deep charcoal with a white marking at the chest in the exact configuration of the Sealbreaker's brand's 7 interlocking circles, visible and immediate and impossible to misread for any wolf who had read the relevant texts. She was not small. The wolf form of a Sealbreaker's carrier was documented in the texts as reflecting the capabilities scope in its physical expression. She was not the largest wolf that the old texts described a capable alpha producing. She was something in a different category, not physically overwhelming, but carrying in her presence the specific quality of the brand's authority made visible. The formation leaders stopped moving. The market around them had already cleared, the civilian wolves responding to the sudden shift and the operational tension with the practice speed of a community that had been through enough that its instinct for clearing dangerous spaces was well developed. She opened her mouth. She said one word. She said, "Kneel." The resonance conditions of the Eastern Market carried the word at full projection range. 16 syndicate operatives went to their knees. Not slowly. The involuntary compliance of the Sealbreaker's brand activation did not allow for the delay of a considered response. It was immediate and complete and allowed no gap between the hearing and the obeying. 16 wolves on their knees in the Eastern Market. The market was completely silent. She shifted back. She stood in the center of the Eastern Market in her dark traveling coat with the 16 syndicate operatives kneeling around her and the market wolves watching from wherever they had sheltered and the specific ringing quality of a space that has just experienced something it did not have a previous category for. The capital's response wolves arrived in the next 2 minutes. Dorian arrived 1 minute after them. He was not in formal clothing. He was in the dark fitted clothing he wore for the operational situations he had insisted on being physically present for since the beginning of his reign, dark jacket over dark fitted tactical clothing. The Alpha King's insignia present but not prominently displayed. He looked at the 16 wolves still kneeling. He looked at Sable. He said, "You were requested to shelter in place." She said, "I did not think 16 operatives in the Eastern Market should be left to determine their own next decision while they waited for the response deployment." He said, "And the solution was to activate in the market." She said, "The solution was to remove their capacity for further decision-making while the response deployed. It was efficient." He said, "The market resonance conditions." She said, "I tested them on day 4. You were present." He said, "I remember." He looked at the 16 kneeling wolves again. He said, "The activation. They are still under it." She said, "The brand's activation duration on a single command is variable. The old texts suggest it persists until the carrier releases it or until the command has been fulfilled. Kneeling is not a time-limited command. I am going to need to release them." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Rise." The 16 wolves rose. They rose with the specific quality of people who have just had the experience of doing something their bodies did completely without their consent, and who are now in the process of understanding the full implications of that experience. Several of them looked at each other. Several of them looked at Sable. None of them made any move toward aggression. The response wolves moved in and the situation was contained, and Dorian stood beside Sable in the market and said, quietly enough for only her, the intelligence breach. You identified it. She said, someone in the administrative structure knew my market schedule for the 9th morning. The access to that schedule is limited. Narrow the access list. He said, already running it. He said, Sable. She looked at him. He said, are you all right? Not formally. With the same directness he had used in the North Courtyard, and in the study, and in every conversation they had had across 9 days. She said, yes. The activation is not physically taxing. It is cognitively significant. I need about an hour of quiet. He said, come back to the palace. I have a library. She said, I know. I have been using it. He said, I know. She said, you have been monitoring the access log. He said, I have been noting what you read. For the same reason you have been reading it. She said, you are building a picture of what I am going to need. He said, yes. She looked at him for a moment. She said, the library would be good. They walked back to the palace. The market behind them was already returning to its morning function with the specific resilience of a market that has seen things and kept going. The Greyvale Syndicate's formal response to the capital's account of the 9th-day incident arrived 3 days later and constituted the beginning of the most significant treaty renegotiation in the Northern Territories in 40 years. Sable wrote the position paper that drove the Iron Spire Pact's participation in that renegotiation. It was the most read document the Treaty Council produced that year. Nobody found that surprising. Chapter 5. What the silence had protected. The formal classification of the Sealbreaker's brand took 11 days to complete after the 9th-day incident. Not because the documentation was insufficient. Sable's 23 pages plus the 3 Harrowmere sources plus the Royal Restricted Archive materials plus the 9 days of North Courtyard testing data constituted a formal record that was more comprehensive than anything the Royal Bloodline classification system had processed in a generation. The 11 days were required because the governance framework that needed to be built around the classification did not have a template. And building a governance framework without a template in the Treaty Council's institutional culture was a process that could not be rushed without producing something that would need to be rebuilt in 2 years. Sable was in every session. She was not in every session because Dorian had asked her to be. She was in every session because she had 4 years of preparation and 23 years of being the most observant wolf in any room she occupied, and the Treaty Council sessions needed someone who could identify when a proposed governance structure was being quietly shaped in a direction that served an institutional interest rather than the stated purpose. She identified this 3 times in 11 sessions. The first time she wrote a note and passed it to Dorian. The second time she spoke directly into the session. The third time she simply looked at the council member responsible for the quiet shaping and held eye contact until the member revised their position. Dorian observed all 3 methods and said nothing about them in session. After the 3rd session he said, in the corridor outside the council chamber, the eye contact method was the most efficient. She said, it was also the most entertaining. He looked at her. She said, I have been watching people not look at me for 4 years. Looking at them and having them look away is its own particular satisfaction. He said, I imagine it is. The formal classification was adopted on the 20th day after her arrival. The document was 41 pages and was the most carefully worded 41 pages that the Treaty Council had produced in a decade because it was the document that everyone paying attention in the Northern Territories understood would set the precedent for how rare bloodline capabilities were governed going forward, and the interests arrayed around getting the precedent right or wrong were significant enough that the Council had taken the full 11 days of sessions to make sure every sentence was the sentence it needed to be. Sable had written 12 of those sentences herself. directly into the document during sessions, because the council member responsible for the relevant sections had produced versions that were technically accurate and practically insufficient. And she had said so in each case, and had then produced the replacement sentence, and the council had adopted each one without extended debate, because the replacement was demonstrably better. The council was not used to this. They became used to it over 11 days. The classification document established the full scope and limitations of the Sealbreaker's brand as a hereditary bloodline capability, the governance framework under which the carrier operated within the kingdom's institutional structure, the specific conditions under which the capability could be activated and the specific conditions under which it could not, the carrier's formal authority in treaty proceedings where the capability's governance implications were directly relevant, and the formal status of the carrier as an independent sovereign agent within the kingdom's framework rather than a royal asset or a ward of the crown. That last clause had required the longest negotiation. Sable had held the line on it across 3 sessions. Dorian had held it with her. He had held it in a way that communicated clearly to the council that this was not a position he was taking because the formal record required it, but a position he was taking because he agreed with it on its merits and was not going to be moved from it by institutional resistance that did not have a principled argument behind it. The council had found the principled argument. The clause was in the document. After the adoption session, she stood in the corridor outside the council chamber with the finalized document in her hand and Dorian beside her and the treaty council members moving past them in the specific way of people who have completed something significant and are processing the completion. She said, "It is done." He said, "It is." She said, "I have been working toward this for 4 years." He said, "I know." She said, "I did not expect the toward to include this." He said, "This." She said, "The North Courtyard. The 3 hours of testing. The 11 sessions. The corridor conversations." She said, "You." He looked at her. She said, "I prepared for the formal classification. I prepared for the governance negotiation. I did not prepare for a king who read the primary sources before the summaries and who wrote me a note signed with his name and not his title." He said, "Is that a complaint?" She said, "No." He said, "Good." He said, "I also did not prepare for certain things." She said, "What things?" He said, "For someone who had been silent for 4 years to walk into a formal assessment and spend 11 days being the most precise mind in every session she attended. For someone who had been carrying an enormous capability entirely alone to have developed a framework for it that was better than anything the Royal Archive had produced. For the specific quality of your voice after 4 years of silence." She said, "The specific quality." He said, "It is a voice that knows the weight of every word it uses. Because it has been weighing them for 4 years without speaking them. That is a quality that is not manufactured and cannot be acquired any other way." She said, "You have been thinking about my voice." He said, "I have been thinking about several things. Your voice is one of them." She said, "What are the others?" He said, "The document you brought. The corridor conversation. The note I sent and whether you read the name at the bottom before the content." She said, "I read the name first." He said, "I thought you might." She said, "Dorian." He said, "Yes." She said, "The formal classification specifies that I am an independent sovereign agent within the kingdom's framework." He said, "I wrote that clause." She said, "I know. I want to make sure you understand what it means in practical terms." He said, "I believe I do." She said, "It means that whatever is happening in these corridors and in the North Courtyard and in the study is happening on my terms as well as yours. Not as a royal proceeding. Not as an asset relationship. Whatever it is." He said, "I understood that from the moment you put the 23 pages on the table." She said, "Good." She said, "Then I would like to talk to you. Not about the classification. Not about governance. Something else." He said, "The library." She said, "Yes." They walked to the library. The library was the room in the Ashvale Palace that she had been using every morning for 11 days, Because it was the room with the most books and the most natural light and the specific quality of a space that had been organized around the assumption that its occupant valued being able to think without interruption. She had the 3 Harrowmere sources on the table when they arrived because she had been there before the council session. He sat across the table from her. She said, "There is a 4th application of the Sealbreaker's brand that is documented in the 3rd Harrowmere source and not in anything in the Royal Archive. I have not included it in the formal classification document because it requires further verification, and I am not comfortable putting unverified capability descriptions in a governance document." He said, "What application?" She said. The text described the carrier's voice as capable of releasing what they call sealed bonds. Not creating bonds. Not breaking them. Releasing seals that have been placed on existing bonds through external suppression. The mechanism is not fully described, but the implication is that the brand has a restorative function alongside the command function. He said, "Releasing sealed bonds." She said, "It could mean many things. Bond suppression has been used as a governance mechanism in pack politics for centuries. If the brand can release those suppressions, then its governance implications are considerably larger than what we documented." He said, "And the verification," she said, "requires identifying a suppressed bond and testing the release." "I have not had the opportunity." He said, "What kind of bond?" She held his gaze. She said, "The kind that forms between wolves who are compatible in ways that neither of them fully understood until they were in the same room." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Sable." She said, "The text suggests the carrier knows when a sealed bond is present because the brand responds to it." "I want to be precise about this." He said, "Be precise." She said, "My brand has been responding to your presence since the morning in the North Courtyard." Not the command activation. Something else. Something the 3rd Harrowmere source describes as the recognition signal, the brand identifying a suppressed bond. She said, "I do not know what suppressed it. I do not know how long it has been sealed. The texts are incomplete on the mechanism. What I know is what I have been observing, and I am not going to pretend I have not been observing it, because 4 years of not speaking did not cure me of the habit of looking at things directly." He said, "No. I did not imagine it would." He said, "I have been reading the 3rd Harrowmere source since yesterday." She said, "The passage about the recognition signal." He said, "Yes." She said, "And?" He said, "And I have been thinking about what it means to have something sealed for a very long time without knowing it was sealed, and what it means when the thing that identifies the seal is a wolf who spent 4 years in silence learning the weight of every word she uses." He said, "I think verification is a reasonable next step." She looked at him with those charcoal dark eyes that had been reading the world with complete accuracy for 23 years. She said, "Yes." She said the word and the brand activated, and the specific frequency of the release function moved through the library and through both of them, and the seal on whatever had been suppressed between them since before either of them had words for it released with a specific quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and was now simply what it was. He felt it. He said, "Yes." Not as a command response. As a person recognizing something he had not known was missing until the moment he had it. The formal record of the Sealbreaker's brand classification became the most referenced governance document in the Northern Territories for the next 30 years. The 4th application was added to the document in a supplementary addendum 6 months after the original adoption, following successful verification. The addendum was the only section of the 41-page document that both the carrier and the king signed. In the Dusk Hollow Pack, Destan the Beta's son received a formal letter from the Royal Administrative Office informing him that his conduct toward a pack member over a 4-year period had been documented in the Royal Inquiry Record and would be reviewed as part of the broader inquiry into the pack's treatment of classified bloodline carriers. He did not say anything about it. Some silences, it turned out, were not chosen. That is the story of Sable Voss. The Omega who was mocked for 4 years for not speaking while she spent those 4 years building the most comprehensive private record of her own capability ever assembled by a living wolf. Who chose silence not from weakness, but from the specific intelligence to understand that speaking would cost more than the mockery? Who walked into the Alpha King's capital with 23 pages of her own research and said everything the world needed to hear in exactly the right order? If this story moved you, then do all 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Leave a comment and tell us your favorite moment. Was it the courtyard, the market, the library, or the last word? Share this with everyone who deserves a heroine whose silence was never empty. Like the video so more people find Sable. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.